All right. Good afternoon, Kirk. How are you doing today?
I think I'm doing pretty well, Sheldon. I managed to actually sleep through the night last night pretty much without any disasters happening, no taps running all night, that sort of thing. That actually happened a few nights ago. I woke up around midnight and I could hear a strange noise. And what's that? Finally, I got myself out of bed, went downstairs, and here's the kitchen tap running full blast into the sink. And I've been doing that for at least an hour and a half. But nope, everything was fine last night. No surprises. How about yourself?
So were you like doing dishes and just totally forgot, or what
No, my
happened?
wife had actually run the tap for something just before she went upstairs, and then got distracted, did something else, and there you go. The tap was left running at maximum speed.
I'll admit I've done that a few times.
Yeah, but fortunately, it's we have our own well, and that well is powered by solar energy, which comes from the sun. So the sun didn't look like it was running out of power recently. So it
I
doesn't
don't know.
actually.
I've seen some studies that potentially it is.
Oh, eventually, yeah, it
Oh.
does. It's using up fuel at a horrendous rate. Just be thankful that you don't have to pay the fuel bill to run the sun.
Well, I have to pay the fuel bill to run my house, and that feels like I'm getting burned a little bit
That's bad
too. So
enough.
yeah.
Yeah, that's bad enough.
All right. Well, in the green room here, we've got Michael Horner. So I'll bring him up. Kirk, why don't you introduce this guy? I'll just say this: when I joined staff 25 years ago, Michael was already a highly respected person, and I got to build one of his first websites. And so that was always a claim to fame for me. It's actually on my business card that I've run out of now. But yeah, so Kirk, why don't you introduce Michael?
Sure. Yeah, Michael.
Oh,
It
Michael,
was
are you
our.
frozen?
What'd you say?
I think Michael might be frozen. We've lost Michael.
Uh-oh.
Okay, I'll watch for him to come back, and
Okay.
then
Let's hope
yeah.
he returns. Oh,
Well,
I
let's
see.
introduce him, and then
Yeah, I see some lip movement over there on the side. So I don't know whether it's his bandwidth or what, but yeah, I'll introduce Michael. So,
okay.
as you said, Sheldon, same here. Michael was already a legend decades ago, a speaker at universities across Canada at that time. I think when I first came on staff, he was just wrapping up a master's degree in philosophy at the University of Toronto, and began to become a very popular speaker at universities all the way across Canada. He's probably spoken at most of them, most of the larger universities by now. And the other thing about Michael is that his specialty over the years has been uh, items pertaining to the defense of the rational position that Christianity has when it comes to what you should put your faith in. And another thing, a little known fact about Michael is he actually has an interest in basketball, but not just an interest. Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about your basketball background, starting, I think, way back at the University of Calgary, unless I'm sadly mistaken here.
Yeah, I do have a love affair with basketball, but it started at age 10. The first time the ball was put in my hands, I just loved it. And it did lead me to end up playing university ball at the University of Calgary. So if anyone knows the name of the teams from Calgary, you will understand when I say that I'm a dinosaur in more ways than one.
Good old
Yeah,
University of
So
Calgary Dinos.
and
Dino,
you've
yeah.
coached for years now, haven't you?
I kept playing up until age 63, but I also, coached off and on at high school level, club programs, um, college level, and the university level. And
Yeah.
that all came to an end about 2019. And so now I have a whole lot more time on my hands.
A
Yeah,
lot of
well,
things came to an end in 2019.
2019, yeah. And judging from those books behind you, one thing I should say about Michael here. Michael's problem is not having not enough information or knowledge on a lot of different fascinating topics. It's the sheer amount that Michael has read and studied over the years. And he is actually a wealth of information. And that's why I'm excited about bringing him on today to talk about something that keeps coming up all the time. And that is this idea circulating around that religion is the worst thing ever that's happened to humanity. And for example, there's Christopher Hitchens' famous book, God is Not Good, and a lot of social media stuff that just constantly is saying denigratory things about religion in general. Now, I wouldn't, and neither will Michael, try and defend religion in general, because there are a lot of different world religions and a lot of different beliefs and practices of those world religions. But today we're going to look at Christianity specifically. And the question is Christianity the best thing that's ever happened in human history? Now, immediately, I would, if you were to take a poll, I'm pretty sure.
Clickbait.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure most people would say no. A few people might say it's been decent, but it's not the best thing that's ever happened ever. But I would expect that a lot of people would have real reservations about affirming anything good that Christianity has done. In fact, I find that they're almost completely ignorant of any good that Christianity has ever done in human history, when in fact the truth is really impressive. And so, Michael, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about how you got into this topic about what has the impact of Christianity been like in history? So just maybe just a little chronological history of how you got into this.
Right. Initially, I was researching that subject about 15 to 20 years ago, because I just wanted to speak on it with some intelligence. And I began reading the works of the sociologist Rodney Stark, who just passed away fairly recently, actually. And Rodney Stark was an agnostic sociologist and studied the history of Christianity. And as a result of discovering all the positive impact of Christianity, decided to become a Christian. So I researched that, spoke on it for a number of years, but then in more recent years, in the last 6-7 years, I wanted to answer a question that I think a lot of people are having, wondering about. How did our current culture, how did our Western civilization, let's say, get to this spot it's in right now, with the ideas that it has and the ideas that dominate it? A lot of people think that things have become a little discombobulated when it comes to the thing that's sort of governing our culture, and things that used to be considered good are now evil, and things that used to be considered evil are now good. And it does in some ways seem to be a little bit upside down. And I wanted to know, well, how do we get here? So as I began studying that question, it led me back to the Enlightenment period, and it became very clear to me that during the Enlightenment, a key motivation of Enlightenment thinkers was anti-religion, and specifically anti-Christian, since that was the main religion in Western civilization. And that was the focus, to marginalize Christianity, if not completely eliminate it, if humans are going to have any sort of progress or flourishing.
Tell us a little bit, Michael, just
go ahead.
explain what the Enlightenment is for some of our viewers may not be familiar. What was the Enlightenment? When
it's
did
usually
it occur?
considered the time period of 1800s, where the concept of light versus darkness was used deliberately to try to show that we have come out of a dark ages, and they actually gave the phrase dark ages to the time period between around 500 and 1400 AD, and that now coming out of the dark ages, we're in the period of enlightenment. So we've seen this new light, and the focus was to challenge the authority of Christian tradition, and Christian spirituality. And so you had an emphasis on reason, which kind of implied that there was no reason prior to the Enlightenment. It's almost like they invented it. Science, with capital S, was kind of invented as, or at least by the people who were Enlightenment atheists, it was kind of spoken of as the alternative to revelation. So reason and science became the alternative to revelation, even though the actual real scientists were basically Christians. It's Christians that started science. So the Enlightenment period started then, and it's continued on pretty seamlessly from that point now, where I drew the conclusion that the number one cultural assumption that a lot of people have is that Christianity is the cause of most of our problems, and we need to get rid of it. And I thought I need to go back to the impact of Christianity. And it so happens there have been some new writings on that, in addition to Rodney Stark. One of the key ones is a huge book called Dominion by Tom Holland. Not Tom Holland from Spider-Man, but Tom Holland, the historian from Britain. And John Dixon in a book called Bullies and Saints. In a book, The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener, have all focused on the positive impact of Christianity, not ignoring the negative impact, though. And I just want to say at the top here that we're not going to have time to study all the different rabbit trails that this leads to. And my focus today is to try to help people see the tremendous positive impact that Christianity, or what I like to call the Jesus Revolution, has had on history. At some point, we'll need to talk about the bad and the evil that has been done in the name of Christianity, for sure. But that's all people know nowadays. We need to understand the positive good, and then that will lead to some application points, I think.
Yeah, that's excellent, Michael. And I should mention, for the sake of our viewers, that we're not going to try and cover everything here in just one live stream episode. The plan is that we're going to have Michael back for several episodes. And I think today we're going to look at largely from the first century up until the end of the 1800s. Then we can look at the modern period from 1900s and right up into the 2000s now, and the 21st century. And also we're going to look at probably an entire episode at some of the negative things that are being attributed to Christianity as well. So there'll be a number of episodes here.
And just for those of you watching now or on the archive later, please let us know what your thoughts are. What's your view on Christianity and how it relates to your life, your family, your culture? Tell us what your thoughts are, because I think it's something that will allow us to address some of the questions and stuff in future episodes. So give us your comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when we come on with another live stream later. And yeah, but let's get back into it. So go ahead, Michael. Let us know what did your study show you?
Well, I'm going to try to mention at least 10 to 12 positive results that came from the Jesus Revolution, and maybe highlight just a few of them. First of all, we need the context. This Jesus Revolution came into the context of ancient pagan religions, and we need to understand how brutal the ancient pagan world really was. This new worldview, this new Jesus worldview, was rooted in a caring God of love and mercy, which is quite a contrast to the pagan deities. It was also rooted in human beings being created in the image of this caring and loving God, and therefore having value, worth, and dignity. And that was just unheard of in the ancient pagan world.
Can you give an example, Michael, of what like the pagan some of the pagan gods might have been, and some of the evil that was done in their name?
Well, maybe even a better example would be what they were willing to allow in terms of a positive view of humans. You're probably aware that there's some pagan religions that did view their leaders, their rulers, their kings as somehow sons of God in terms of the pagan God. But it was only kings or rulers who would ever get that connection. For the rest of humanity, they were considered dirt. But Christianity, based on the Jewish scriptures, because this is a continuation of the Jewish religion. The first Christians were Jews. Believed that every human being was created in the image and likeness of God and had full worth, value, and dignity. And that was just completely unheard of. So, for example, the simple phrase that we're familiar with from John 3:16, for God so loved the world, just would have caused puzzled looks on an educated pagan, because Aristotle taught that the gods could feel no love for mere humans. And a God of mercy, well, that was unthinkable, because mercy was actually a defect of character, because it was a sign of weakness. And so the idea that the gods care how we treat one another would be just absurd at that time. And yet this is what the Jesus Revolution came into this. So when you look at the pagan gods, they seem actually quite frivolous when you compare it to God the Father of Christian thinking. They seem like, I don't know, wicked incompetence compared to Jesus, his son. And so this view of the full value and worth and human dignity of every human being was so radical. And we're going to see that this theme has carried its way right up to our present time. And that it was based on one other key point, the verse in Galatians 3:28, where the Apostle Paul said, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Well, this is crazy. Those were all, in our culture, we're aware of the tribalism that exists, and there's us and then the other, and we're fighting. Well, these were the major splits in that culture. Jew or Gentile, there's no coming together of those two. Slave nor free, there's no way they're to come together. And even male or females were looked down upon. And yet Christianity was teaching, no, you're all one, you're all of the same value. So that, based on also because of the being made in the image of God, those 2 points just radically changed the world. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen overnight, but it did begin to happen as the Christians began to act differently. A major problem during that time was infanticide. People who didn't want babies because they were either female or just didn't want them, or they were maybe deformed, or for whatever reason, they could just leave them exposed out on the street. And that was considered quite all right. Well, Christians began looking for and picking up and caring for these exposed infants. And Christians expanded that care. The most fortunate people in Christianity had the view that they were responsible to help those in need, especially their own spiritual brothers and sisters, but also their pagan neighbors. And this really bothered the pagan emperor Julian. He complained, and this is his quote, "Those impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well." And that really cheesed him off. And he tried to get their pagan temples to act like Christians and provide that same type of care. And he was completely unsuccessful, because their worldview just didn't support that. Now, this led even further when Christians finally got some political power, or at least some influence, in the 4th and 5th centuries. they applied this principle of care to establish the first hospitals. And this shouldn't surprise us. How many hospitals do you know that are titled Saint so and so? Christians started the first hospitals, and that has continued on for 2 millennia. Now, there's all sorts of other implications that come from this first point about human dignity and caring for others. But let's move on to the second one. I'm just going to mention it because there's just not enough time to go into it, and it would take us the rest of the time. But Christianity actually provided an improvement for the status of women. Now, most people would not think that would be the case. But because of the way Jesus treated women, for example, he allowed Mary and Martha, the sisters of his good friend Lazarus, to sit in on the teaching that he provided as a rabbi. Unheard of in the pagan world. You don't teach women. And other examples of the way Jesus treated women began to have its effect. Things didn't change overnight, but it led to Christianity being extremely popular to women. Women became Christians because of all sorts of positive benefits that were there, in the way they were treated in terms of marriage and divorce, and many other aspects. The status of women was improved. Again, things didn't change overnight. It happened gradually. Let me tell you a story about the third one. There's a monk named Telemachus who had heard about the gladiatorial combats, basically human slaughter for sport in the bloody gladiatorial combats. I guess it's kind of like MMA, except there weren't any rules, and you fought to the death, and this was entertainment. Well, he came to one of these and showed up, and when he saw what was happening, he jumped down into the arena and basically said, "For Christ's sake, stop this." Well, the crowd wasn't too happy with Telemachus, and they basically stoned him to death at that point. But because of his willingness to do that, just a few short weeks later, the emperor at the time ended gladiatorial combats. So the view of the value of every human being plus one Christian willing to put his life on the line ended the human slaughter for sport.
I think that's an important point there, Michael, how throughout history there have been times when just one Christian acting on the basis of what the Bible actually teaches has had a very significant impact on history. I see that in that particular incident. We're going to see it later on when it comes to slavery. But I was, just before you move on, when you were talking about the status of women, there is a remarkable passage in the New Testament that indicates if a husband is not treating his wife with love and she has something against him, it says the Lord will not hear your prayers. And that we might say, well, good, I'm glad, I agree with that, type of thing. But we have to realize that in that culture, in that day, that was revolutionary. When a husband status and interaction with God is contingent on how well he's treating his wife as well. Like if it's wrong, if he's mistreating her, that not only creates a barrier between her and him, but God notes that. And so there's a very strong statement there made to really raise the status of women in the first century from what was normally went on, where women were just basically treated as often as chattel, or their feelings weren't respected.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And it takes time for change to happen, and that was the most surprising part of my research. In fact, maybe I'll throw this in now. We'll come back to it later. But one of the key things that I read was by Glenn Scrivener in his book, The Air We Breathe, where he pointed out that when Jesus was talking about his kingdom he was bringing, and how it was going to grow, he compared it to leaven in a batch of dough, and he said the kingdom is going to grow slowly, just like leaven slowly spreading to all the dough. And that was quite interesting when I thought about that, because I'm seeing very slow progress in terms of how Christianity is changing the world. And Scrivener emphasized, but it did happen, but it just happened slowly, exactly how Jesus predicted it. And so that helped me once I began to understand that this was happening probably just the way Jesus intended it, even though it might not be as fast as we think it should happen. So what I've shared so far is kind of based on the sort of the ancient times. Now let's move into the time that has been labeled the Dark Ages, which most historians do not use that phraseology anymore. They will call it the Middle Ages, and even that is somewhat problematic. I've already given you a little bit of the background there, but let me tell you about some of the inventions, some of the progress that happened in the Dark Ages. In the so-called Dark Ages, the first economies were created that didn't rely solely on human muscles. They invented water mills, perfected dams, produced paper mechanically, which no other civilization had managed. How about windmills, the horse collar, horseshoes, the heavy plow, fish farming, 3-cycle crop rotation, cloth manufacturing, chimneys, eyeglasses, clocks, the round-bottom ship, the stern post rudder, the compass. On the cultural side, we have universities were begun, first in embryonic forms, but eventually in very similar to modern forms. Modern languages were invented. Music with several melodies, something brand new was invented. You had Gothic architecture with its flying buttresses and stained glass. All this was during the so-called Dark Ages, where it was just ignorance and supposedly barbarians. But it was actually during this alleged time that the influence of the Christian worldview provided European technology and science that overtook and surpassed the rest of the world precisely during these so-called Dark Ages. So that by the 10th century, Europe was way ahead in terms of farming equipment and techniques, unmatched capacities and use of water and wind power, superior military equipment and tactics. And a lot of this was actually based on something that Rodney Stark, the sociologist that I was studying, emphasized. In fact, this is his main thesis, that what Christianity brought was a focus on reason. And as a result of reason, also progress. In other words, reason and progress came from Christianity, in contrast to the pagan worldview, where the more unreasonable or the more mysterious the religion was, the more likely it was to be admired or accepted. Whereas Christianity brought with it, no, there needs to be reason here. And if reason, then we can understand what God is saying to us, and we can begin to progress from the way things used to be, whereas the ancient worldviews were almost all circular. It was just history repeating itself. The idea of progress made no sense whatsoever. And so all these inventions within the Dark Ages were based on the idea of reason and progress that came from the Jesus Revolution.
By the way, I should remind anybody who's listening that if you have any comments, please don't hesitate to post them in the chat or in the comments section, and we'll see if we can get to those as well.
I do have one question. Can you define reason? Because it comes up quite a bit in Kirk's chats with me, but I know it's one of those things that people throw around, but can you define it?
Well, sure. I mean, I think it's just the use of our mental faculties to think in an ordered way, and which means based on the sort of fundamental axioms of logic, which philosophers and thinkers, from the time of the Greek philosophers, for example, had begun to delineate. So it's a bit, I guess it means just thinking carefully according to the appropriate rules. Would you add anything, Kirk?
I might say it just in different words slightly. I might say it's the aspect of reasoning from certain premises to arrive at a logical conclusion. And it's not just limited to how am I going to cross the river here. That doesn't take a lot of reasoning, a little bit. But it goes way beyond that. It starts to reason, let's say, for example, why do apples fall from trees? And why does it seem that they always accelerate at the same rate, whether it's an apple or something else? Why are we here? And beginning to start gathering premises together and arriving at logical conclusions. Or why should we believe that this religious person here is actually not simply insane? And in fact, you might laugh at that, so some people might, but I was reading an account in another culture where one of the main marks of a person who was in closer contact with the spiritual world would be people who were clearly had psychological serious disabilities. An epileptic episode, for example, would be taken as proof that this person now is closer to the spiritual world than we are. But reason comes in and say, why would we believe that the suspension of ability to make decisions and to reason through things is somehow replaced by non-reason. So basically, reason isn't limited to Christianity, but authentic reasoning is very much promoted by Christianity. In fact, there's one passage in the New Testament where we're basically commanded to be able to give a defense for the things that we believe, which is rather unique when you start looking at a broad survey of religions. That part of one of the commands of Christianity is to be able to give a reasoned defense. And if you want to know what he meant by that, the Greek word is apologia. Just look at, let's say, Plato, the chapter entitled Apologia, where Plato gives a defense in court for an accusation that he has to deal with. And so it's a very well-reasoned defense that you might see in court. And this is what God has asked us to do as Christians, to be able to give a well-reasoned defense for the things that we believe. So the aspect of rationality and reason is very important within Christianity, and as you've brought out, and how it actually flourishes under Christianity. And if it's not flourishing, then you have to go back and say, is there something wrong with what we are calling Christianity? Maybe that itself has deviated from what the Bible describes.
All right, so back to Michael. Sorry for the rabbit trail. I just thought we're using the word, and it would be good to have a definition there.
No, that was good, actually, because during the Enlightenment time period, the word reason was given a very special meaning. It was meant to be in contrast to revelation, so that revelation can't be reasonable. And that's still the way people think about it, right? They think, oh, well, you're just as a faith position. And we know what faith is, just the opposite of reason. And no, Christianity has been committed to reason from the beginning. That's part of the Enlightenment atheist myth that developed. Now, I need to show here that Christians were actually part of this problem. Protestants worked together with Enlightenment atheists to pile on Catholics and to try to show that all Catholic history, especially during the alleged Dark Ages, were actually dark ages. And then once society had sort of done the job on Catholics, then the Enlightenment turned their sights on Protestants. So we helped the Enlightenment attack the Catholics, and then they attacked the Protestants, and we're still in this tension that the Enlightenment thinkers created between reason and revelation. And that leads us right into my next point, which is the issue of science. Because it wasn't as though there were dark ages, then all of a sudden you had a little bit of light during the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment came and you had the big light. No, there was a smooth, gradual transition from the Middle Ages, I want to call them, rather than the Dark Ages, to the Renaissance, when there was some increased desire to learn more deeply, and then the Reformation fit in between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and that's where the Protestants kind of came on board, unfortunately, and then the Enlightenment, and science is being kind of the key thing that an Enlightenment thinker will want to point to that represents them. But here's what's interesting. Leading figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Kepler, Lavoisier, Faraday, and many more were Christians. These are the early scientists. These are the ones that actually built science, and they saw themselves as cultivating a scientific method that was completely compatible with Christian thinking. There was no war between Christianity and science. Science actually grew in the soil of Christian understanding. How? Well, God created an intelligible world, is the Christian view, with laws of nature that could be studied. And human beings were created in the image of God and have the power of reason to investigate and better take care of God's creation. So the first Christians, practicing Christians, as opposed to the Enlightenment apologist philosophers, the first scientists were Christians. We can bring that a little closer to home. Just an interesting point here. If you look at all the Nobel Prize winners in science since the inception of the Nobel Prize in 1901, and overwhelmingly Christians are winners. 73% of the winners in chemistry would be people with a Christian worldview. 65% of the winners in physics and 62% of winners in medicine self-identify as Christians. So this idea that there's an inherent conflict between science and Christianity, which the Enlightenment has taught and is still part of our culture, is just not true. Science grew in the very soil of Christianity. Now, Stark emphasizes reason, as I said, and he also says reason is the foundation for freedom and democracy that has grown in Western civilization as well. Not only did it prompt the pursuit of science, but the evolution of democratic theory and practice. It's the belief in the equality of all human beings in the eyes of God that led to the rise of individual freedoms, capitalism, and democracy, which only took place in Western Europe. Now, the big one is slavery. I skipped over a section earlier where I could have mentioned where Christians in earlier times had challenged slavery and had done what they could to get slaves released and so on, and in huge numbers. The slavery wasn't completely annihilated, but it was significantly reduced because of the influence of Christianity in the early years in the West. In all of history and all of the world, it is ubiquitous. Slavery has always been there and it's everywhere. But in the West, slavery only returned after Christianity's cultural influence had waned in the 17th century. About the time the Enlightenment is happening, the influence of Christianity is waning. And so that's when you began to have the Atlantic slave trade. And sadly, many self-identified Christians were involved in that, and it's definitely a blot on the history of Christianity. But some serious Christians saw what their earlier brothers and sisters had seen centuries before, that slavery was a gross violation of the Christian belief in the equal value and inherent dignity of all human beings, and so they came to the forefront in the battle. And basically, you see the names of people like Wilberforce in England, and Garrison and Douglas in the United States. The anti-slavery movement grew in the soil of the Quakers at first, and then eventually the evangelicals within Protestantism. Those two groups led the fight against slavery. And William Wilberforce, after decades, finally stopped the slave trade, but then it took him another 25 years to actually get the emancipation of all slaves, a total of 46 years. And Wilberforce insisted, this is a quote, "A private faith that does not act in the face of oppression is no faith at all." So again, this is an example of what Kirk mentioned earlier. You get a Christian here or there actually acting on the teachings of Jesus and the Christian scriptures. And Glenn Scrivener, whose book I mentioned, The Air We Breathe, which I highly recommend, and it's very readable, it's not that long, excellent book on this subject. He emphasizes that changes like this usually involve two aspects. It usually involves the worldview and the right sort of thinking that provides the foundation, but it also provides some sort of public, maybe even political, some sort of action. So he mentions this to challenge people who say, no, Christians shouldn't be involved in culture at all. And he says, no, it's only as you're applying your beliefs and you're involved in culture that change takes place. And this makes me think back to what Jesus said. My kingdom is going to advance. And remember, his idea of a kingdom is not an earthly kingdom like we think. His idea of a kingdom is the spread of his rule in the hearts of individuals. The more people that submit to him as king is the spreading of the kingdom of God. And then through their outward actions, like Scrivener emphasizes, can begin to influence the culture around us. And that actually is where I want to get to here today. That there's two implications for these points that we've looked at. One is for the believer. Once we understand that Jesus predicted that his kingdom's advance was going to be gradual, plus Jesus also said it would start like the smallest seed in the garden and become the largest plant in the garden. That prediction also has taken place. Christianity started as this small, insignificant little group of people and has now become the largest worldview / religion in the world, exactly like Jesus predicted. And thirdly, Jesus said, and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against the advance of my kingdom. Notice who's on the defensive there. It's not the kingdom of God that is trying to hold off the attacks of hell. No, it's the gates of hell are not going to hold off the advance of Jesus' kingdom. Now, this is a kingdom of love and mercy and care and respect for people as having inherent dignity, but it's not going to be stopped. Therefore, for Christians, what's the application? The application is don't give up on the Jesus revolution now. Just because things look bad, and they do in many ways, they look bad. What Jesus predicted has happened, And so his further prediction that the gates of hell will not prevail against it is also going to happen. We know we're on the winning team here. And this is not an issue of triumphalism, saying that we're better than other people. Not at all. This is the idea that God knows what's best for human flourishing. And if we follow what God says, we're going to see people flourish, both individually and collectively.
I think
And
that,
so, go ahead.
Michael, that I just want to really emphasize that point you just made when God said, "I will build my kingdom, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it," despite what it may look like at different points in history. And there have been incidents, there have been cultures, there's been situations in history where it didn't look that way at all. But one person can make an amazing difference. And so you suggested that we need to continue to represent God in this world. And even if our current situation in our own culture, there seems to be a resurgence in things that are wrong, or calling evil right and right wrong. Just one person, and you never know who that's going to be. It could be you as a listener. Just one person that remains focused on the particular mission that God has put before them. For William Wilberforce, he remained focused on abolishing the slave trade. And each of us has an individual ability or talent or mission that God gives us. And we just need to stay focused and not be discouraged, because like God said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it."
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And so this should be an encouragement to us as believers to double down on the two commissions that Jesus has given us. One is the Great Commission, to make disciples of all the nations. Well, how many Christians are actually sharing their faith these days? I don't think it's nearly as high as it was 30 years ago. And even then, it wasn't very high. We need to double down on making disciples, but also the second commission is some people call it the cultural commission, which is to be salt and light in the world. So we make disciples, but we're also to engage our culture, influence. Now, how do you do that? And this raises up all sorts of questions, but as far as I can see what Jesus taught, and there are other examples in history where Christians violated this, we are to do it through reason and loving and gentle persuasion, not force. This is not imposing our views on culture, but this is persuading people to say, please consider this. This we believe will lead to greater human flourishing, in contrast to what you're suggesting. And so that means being involved, I think, in the political process. It means being involved in the lives of your neighbors and your community, and without embarrassment, sharing what you believe will lead to greater human flourishing. And people don't have to become Christians to benefit from the Christian worldview. And in fact, what's so interesting is that most people still do believe in this Christian point that human beings have inherent, intrinsic value, worth, and dignity. What Scrivener points out is that came from Christianity. That's why his book is entitled "The Air We Breathe." He's telling the unbeliever the very air that you breathe, the very air that we all breathe, is Christianity, that we're still actually a Christian culture. And anyone who believes that human beings have intrinsic, inherent value, worth, and dignity is believing something that is based on a Christian worldview, whether they know it or not. And it's become so commonplace now that, the American Constitution just kind of built it right in with a little bit of a nod to God being the foundation, even though those people were not all Christians, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, but he still recognized the connection between the morality that he wanted and the type of government they wanted, and the foundation that was needed. And then the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of human rights doesn't provide the foundation. It just claims that we all know that human beings have inherent value and dignity.
I
Problem
just need
is,
to break in here a bit, Michael,
yeah,
with regard to a couple of things you said. One is your phrase, we're part of a Christian culture. We may not realize it. And that let's stop at that one first. Um, I think when I look around, it doesn't look to me like I'm part of a Christian culture here. But if I understand you correctly, what we're talking about is that there's fundamental assumptions that and cravings that we have that are actually put there by God or part of what Christianity promotes. For example, we all want to get along together. Like the second greatest command Jesus gave us was to love our neighbors ourselves. So we all want to get along together. And I very much see that in our culture, in this push towards inclusivity. Where our culture deviates from God is in its methodology and how can we get along together. That's where I think if we abandon God's principles, we still have that fundamental assumption that we're all of value and we all want to get along together. But then the methodology, we have to come up with our own methodologies. And that's where something else you said cuts in, and that is you can't really change, or we ought not to. Christianity doesn't change by force. I mean, in history, there may be incidents where it was done by force, or we might be tempted to do it by force, but external imposition does not produce internal change. It only produces the facade of change.
right.
So what we actually see in our culture today, and they might put up a bit of resistance to this, but I think what I'm observing in our culture today is the methodology that our culture is employing is by force. It's coercion. It's
Yeah.
utterly censoring and canceling out all opposition and enforcing it to the extent that you can lose your job, you can be expelled from your university and so forth if you don't subscribe to the methodology. I think everybody was subscribed to the intent. We all want to get along together. We all want to love one another, but the methodology is a little bit different. But that might be another episode in discussing that further. But that's why I think Jesus very much was about not forcing people to be followers of Christ, because that's fake. That's not real. It has to be intrinsic.
You're right. What Scrivener writes is that things like equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress are actually all rooted in the teachings of Jesus and the influence of his followers. But how we promote that, or as you said, the methodology changes. And in recent years, it's not Christians who are imposing their view on others as much as it is people with another worldview imposing their view on culture and canceling those that disagree with them. And so it's an imposition of a twisting of the Christian morality into something different, and an imposition of the methodology of force. So that's one of the things that led me into this study in the first place. So that's the first implication. Christians don't give up. We should double down on our commitment to be involved in the Great Commission of making disciples and being salt and light. And we do it in love and gentleness through the power of the Holy Spirit. Second implication is for unbelievers. This is a much bigger task. It's one of the reasons why I'm trying to communicate this material. Unbelievers need to realize that the Enlightenment myth of the Dark Ages and the idea that religion poisons everything is just that, a myth. It is not true. Historians do not view the Dark Ages as dark anymore, but as a time of great progress. And they need to revisit their assumptions about Christianity being the worst, being in the cause. Now, I know we've only talked about some of the positive benefits, and believe me, we're just scratching the surface here. And so, in order to deal with this, one has to revisit the Inquisition and the Crusades and the witch burnings and the Galileo affair and the many examples where Christianity has been connected with very lamentable behavior. And hopefully we'll do that in a future episode. But
Yeah,
it's
we definitely have.
unbelievers have to. Yeah, unbelievers
Yeah.
need to revisit this themselves, and Christians need to help them do that. That would be my view.
Mhm. Oh yeah, I think we really do need to deal with that in another episode. It would be. I don't think the weight of the positive contribution of Christianity can be adequately appreciated if we don't also look at, well, let's take a look at these negative things. For example, I have had countless engagements with people who tell me about terrible things that have been done by so-called Christians or maybe even sincere Christians. And I think one of the things I've often asked at that point is, well, is that what Jesus taught? Let's say, for example, the abuse of little boys in the church. Well, is that what Jesus taught? And most of the time, they will say, well, actually, probably not. But there's other things that Christians, and I think sincere Christians, have done that are not right. They're actually counter to what Christianity teaches, but they've done that because they were being led by the culture of the day. And when
Exactly
you
right.
start being led by the culture of the day, you will accept things. And for example, I think there's a couple of things being done now by, let's say, some progressive branches of Christianity that are flat out wrong, but it's because they're very much led by the culture of the day. And some of these things are so wrong that I think someday even secular culture one day will recognize what were we thinking there in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st when we did these things. But remember the question, is that what Jesus actually taught? And just hold that question in your mind until we can come back to a full episode with this in mind. And I'd like to have Michael back for that episode, the negative things. We have to deal with that.
Yeah, and one thing that I've been thinking through as you've been discussing this is how much of what is going on is reactions to culture. So throughout history, you have the Roman times, you have the Greek times, you have the different cultures that are happening, and I'm seeing sort of Christianity reacting to that a little bit in how they responded, maybe, especially with things like the Crusades. It's a reaction to losing either power or, and I'm seeing that in the States right now. You have a loss of political power in the Christian church, and so there's a reaction to that. How did you notice any of that in the studies that you were doing at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has led me to questions like, oh, how should we engage with our culture, which brings up topics like, theocracy. Is that how Christians should do it? Christian nationalism. Is that how Christians should do it? And I'm a strong believer, no, to both of those. And it's some version of what one scholar calls confident pluralism that I think might be the best model, but I'm out of my depth when we get to political science, and I'm certainly willing to learn from other people. As the key point, as long as we are basing it on love and care and the teachings of Jesus, then I think God can use us to help the world.
Great. Any last comments you want to make for this episode, Michael?
Let me just
We're
finish
hitting that
with
1
a quote.
hour's time frame here.
All right. Well, I have a quote from a good friend of mine. Paul Chamberlain is a professor at Trinity Western University and Axe Seminary, and he encapsulates well what I think we've talked about here. He says, many of the good and humane things that we in the West have come to take for granted and could hardly imagine the world without exist as a result of Christians simply living out the values Christ taught, and in some cases, doing so at great personal sacrifice.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Kirk, any last comments from you? And then I'll just give some instructions to our guests.
Yeah, there's so much we have not covered, which just underscores the need for another episode. So for the people who watch this, be encouraged. There will be one or two more episodes on this topic. I think we really do need to come into the 20th and 21st century, see what Christianity is doing right now, and we really do need to deal with the famous negative events that have been done that are attributed to Christianity, and those will be at least 2 different episodes.
Awesome. So
And I would
those
add
of you who are
also
watching
how
now, go ahead.
I would just add how did all these sort of good values that are based in Christianity kind of get twisted into something quite different now? How did that process happen?
Very good. So those of you who are watching now or later, please give us a comment, hit the like, hit the bell, subscribe, and we will. If you want to have a conversation with either Kirk or Michael, and you don't want to do it in public, maybe you're scared that you'll lose your job or something if you engage. Oh, hey, you never know. Just head over to kirkdurston.com, send an email, and we will get back to you. Thank you all for watching. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. We'll see Kirk in a week. I don't know. I think do we have another guest next week, or are we dealing with angels next week, maybe? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. I've been muting because there's been a lot of racket in the background here that I'll have to fix for next week. But bottom line is, I think next week we have just Sheldon and I, and the following week we have Jonathan Topping, who's going to be talking about, I think, the resurrection of Jesus, some particular aspects of it, and dealing with some of the alternate theories. And so we'll be covering that, I think, in 2 weeks' time, if I got my calendar.
I think that sounds right. I think that sounds right. Awesome. Well, we will see you all later.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Bye for now.